Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining today's webinar hosted by AMCHAM's Trade and Customs Committee. I'm Una Claire Kim, Director of Government and Corporate Affairs at AMCHAM, and I'm very happy to kick off today's webinar. Today's topic, Outlook on the U.S. trade policy towards Asia Pacific, is very relevant to all of us here in Korea. The U.S. trade policy under the Biden administration has been fast evolving, with COVID-19, supply chain issues, and geopolitical dynamics in the region. For countries like South Korea, where the economy is largely driven by export, the global trade landscape has a major impact. In that context, I'm very pleased to have Barbara Weisel with us as our guest speaker today. Barbara is a managing director at Rock Creek Global Advisors, an international economic policy advisory firm where she focuses on international trade and investment policy negotiations, as well as market access and regulatory matters. Barbara has more than 25 years of experience advancing international trade and investment initiatives, expanding market access in Asia-Pacific markets, and resolving specific issues faced by businesses in the region. Prior to her current role, Barbara most recently served as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Southeast Asia and the Pacific. She was the U.S. Chief Negotiator for the 12-country Trans-Pacific Partnership from its inception in 2008 through its signing in 2016. Personally, I cannot think of a better person to discuss today's topic with us. So thank you, Barbara, for being with us today. We also have Ari Arnasi, co-chair of AMCHAM's Trade and Customs Committee, who will moderate the Fireside chat portion of the webinar. Ari is a partner at Shin & Kim, one of Korea's largest law firms. He is an attorney licensed in New York and a graduate of Duke Law School. His practice focuses on international dispute resolution, including arbitration and trade. Prior to coming to Seoul, he worked at the U.S. Court of International Trade and the U.S.-China Business Council. We will first hear from Barbara with her presentation, and then Ari will moderate a fireside chat with Barbara after that. We'll also have a Q&A session at the very end, so please feel free to submit your questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Barbara, now let me hand it over to you.
Thank you for that warm introduction. I want to say good morning and good evening to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I had the chance to visit Seoul a few months ago in that very brief period when people were traveling again, and it was great to be there, but it's also good to be able to get together here by Zoom and to talk about some of the key trade issues that are on the agenda going forward, and I really appreciate the invitation. Today I'm going to talk about a number of topics that I think are on the forefront of the US-Korea trade agenda, and I just have a brief outline here of those issues that I want to cover in the next few minutes. The first is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is something I think all of us have been hearing a lot about. The administration's discussion of a worker-centric trade policy and where that stands, implications for all of that on the regional trade agreements and how Korea should be looking at this and US businesses in Korea, and then more specifically at US-Korea trade relations and their outlook over the coming year or more, including bilateral cooperation and what that means for AMCHAM companies, as well as the outlook for a digital trade agreement, and then just generally what that means for companies. So let me get started. I think the place that I would like to start is where the administration currently is on Asia economic strategy broadly. I think it's very obvious to everybody who works on trade issues that the administration has been on the sidelines for the first year as it regards Asian economic strategy, and many other countries have been very actively engaged in the region. So there's been growing concerns by not just the business community, but Congress and others about the lack of activity and what the implications are. The administration has been very, very active on the military and security side, on the political side, and in making progress toward President Biden's goal of rebuilding relations with partners and allies. But the economic piece of it really has fallen behind. So I think there is interest on the part of the administration to move forward with an affirmative economic strategy. I think there's recognition both of the benefits here of doing so because of the importance of the region to the United States. Everybody's aware that the Asia Pacific is the destination for about 30% of US goods and services exports. And there are other countries who have been very actively negotiating trade agreements. So there are, they have preferential access that US companies no longer have. They're building supply chains and value chains through those agreements and establishing rules based on their interests, and we're not at the table anymore. So by moving now, the US would be able to build and sustain its leadership and influence in the region, revitalize further all of these partnerships and alliances that they're looking to strengthen, and promote fair trade and inclusive economic growth, which is at the heart of what the administration says it wants to do through trade. And then there's also the ability to respond to certain challenges posed by China, including unfair trade practices or trade coercion. The risks of inaction, I think, mirror the other side of the benefits here. If there's no activity on the part of the US and we continue to sit on the sidelines, that will affect our companies and our ability to get into those supply chains and to influence the direction of rules in the region. So I think it's a very much of a move ahead, or the situation will get worse. At the same time, as I think there's real consensus and understanding of what the benefits and risks are of action or inaction, there are political constraints that the administration is operating under, and those are also very, very clear to everybody involved. The first is that there is no trade promotion authority. So in the past, administrations have followed closely the requirements of trade promotion authority as they look to negotiate new trade agreements. There is no trade promotion authority now, and it doesn't appear that trade promotion authority will be renewed anytime in the near future. So as an administration would go forward with a trade agreement, it's very unclear what the congressional requirements would be were they to decide to go forward with a trade agreement. And that's not a really great situation to find yourself in when you want to negotiate a new trade agreement. Some people have said to me, well, look, you negotiated TPP for many years after TPA had expired. But I think there is a real difference between that situation that we were operating under several years ago and where this administration is now, in that there was more of a straight line between the expiration of the old TPA and where the new TPA was expected to go, whereas here there might be much more significant changes. The other issue on political constraints is that Republicans have been the bedrock of free trade and a reliable vote for many, many administrations, and that is not necessarily the case at this point, or at least it's not clear that it's the case. So putting together a coalition of support among members of Congress is something that's just a question mark at this point. And that is the world that the administration's looking at as it's thinking about what it wants to do with an affirmative trade strategy. So looking at the consensus that they've built both on the opportunities and the challenges, but also recognizing the constraints that they have politically, the administration announced in October at the East Asia Summit, or the president announced that the United States would explore development of an Indo-Pacific economic framework. And this was really a very brief statement that he made during a speech. And there wasn't any more detail that was provided than the issues that they hoped to negotiate. You can see even when they announced it, it was fairly tentative. They will explore with partners the development of an economic framework. You will notice that the word trade is nowhere in that statement. It's not a trade agreement, it's an economic framework. And I think much of that reflects the fact there is no Trade Promotion Authority, and there is lack of consensus here in the United States and in the administration about exactly where the administration wants to go on trade. Since then, since the president's announcement, there has been somewhat more discussion about what exactly a framework would be. As you know, after the president made the announcement that the administration would launch this framework, he sent out Secretary Raimondo and USTR Tai to the region, and they both had discussions with various trade partners across the region. But I think at the end of those discussions, many of the countries asked the question of when is the detail going to be provided, and what more can you tell us about what you anticipate doing in this agreement? It is now several months later, and I think it is a little bit more clear, although there are a lot of details to be filled in. And the best way that I can describe what I think it is they're trying to do is to look at this as though they are building a mobile. And the top layer of the mobile, the frame of the mobile, is actually the framework agreement. And that would be an agreement among all the parties that are included in the agreement that would include general commitments to work together on the issues listed by the president in his remarks, and an effort to cooperate and work on these priority issues. Under that framework would be what are being called modules. The modules are those issues that were listed in the president's remarks. So that will, include trade facilitation, digital economy and tech, supply chain resiliency, decarbonization and clean energy infrastructure, worker standards, and anything else. Each of those would operate independently. They would be potentially on their own timeframes, potentially with different types of commitments in each of them. And it remains to be determined whether there would be any linkages, the crossbar in a mobile between the modules that are being negotiated. It may be that each of them is just hanging from the frame at the top, or it may be that some of them are linked as well. And I think that's something still to be determined. Now, the reason that the administration picked these particular topics is because they are issues that are our priority for all of the countries in the region. They're top of mind for all of the countries. Everybody is talking about a digital transition, a climate transition, supply chains, and in critical technologies and medical and pharmaceutical issues. They're talking about infrastructure. So these are all topics that I think the administration thought would be of interest to all the parties, and where they could come up with common approaches to these issues. The rest of the details are under development. They have begun discussions internally about what the issues should be and what kinds of commitments or provisions or discussions they want to do in this group, but they have not been public about that. And I think they are still developing exactly what it is they want to negotiate. I think that there are many of us that have been providing input into the process and trying to make sure that what is negotiated is as robust as possible, but they're still working through the details. Now, in terms of just process, this is being co-led by USTR and the Department of Commerce, with some modules being led by Commerce and some by USTR. And I think there will be an interagency process that includes all the relevant agencies for all of these things. But the process itself is also still being worked out and will add to the time that it takes to finalize the proposals that the administration wants to come forward with. The next question is who would be included in this framework agreement? And I think it is safe to say that all of the countries that the administration has approached already are going to be included or invited to join this. So that would be Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, and I believe they've talked as well to Indonesia and others. There is no final list of countries that will be included, and I think discussions are ongoing, both based on which countries are like-minded and prepared to work with the United States to conclude something meaningful in each of these modules, but also trying to get a broad group of countries that is not a rich man's club, that includes developed and developing countries and ASEAN and Northeast Asian countries, as well as Pacific countries. So I think they want a geographical distribution of countries. They want a developmental distribution, but they also want to make sure that it's a group of countries that's prepared to do something meaningful. So I think the discussions are probably beginning with a lot of these countries now, and we'll be hearing what the final list of countries is, I would imagine, in coming weeks. I think that leads to the question of how does the worker-centric trade policy that the administration has been talking about relate to the work that they're doing on this Indo-Pacific framework or their trade agenda generally. The administration has made worker-centric trade policy the focus of the way it wants to move forward on trade policy. And in every conversation that you have, certainly with USTR Thai, but others as well, they talk about a worker-centric trade policy. But in the speeches so far, the items that are on this slide is essentially what they've said, that they want to empower workers, they want to lead to better outcomes for Americans. And then there's often a lot of discussion about who is providing input into the administration as it develops its trade policies, with the implication that previous administrations have excluded workers or labor unions or certain other stakeholders as they develop trade policy, and that they want to do more to include groups they believe have been excluded from the process in the past. I think that having been part of the process in the past, I would say that that is not an accurate reflection of who has been at the table, but that is their view, and that's how they intend to proceed. So here we are a year into the administration, and there is no clear definition of exactly what a worker-centric trade policy is. Ambassador Tai has given several speeches where there was that were billed as defining what a worker-centric trade policy would be, but in fact those speeches did not actually do that. So what you can go on to date is, as I said, that they want a more inclusive process. Some of the things that they've also pointed to are different types of enforcement mechanisms. One that they refer to frequently is the rapid response mechanism that was in the USMCA, and that was intended to, for instance, allow enforcement against violations of labor rights, and those and they're very short time frames for that. So in other words, the criticism, they want to get at the criticism that dispute settlement takes too long, and for a lot of these issues, the damage is done by the time the dispute settlement panel gives its report. And so that's one thing that they've referred to, particularly as it regards labor. And then they've pointed to their proposals that they put into the WTO negotiating process on forced labor and in fish subsidies negotiations there as another place where they are bringing labor issues into international negotiations where they had not previously had such provisions. And then have talked about standards for combating industrial subsidies. There haven't been specific proposals that have gone anywhere, although I think that is something that they see as important. How that relates to the Indo-Pacific framework, or for that matter, any other negotiation the administration may decide to go forward with, is that this will be the first opportunity to lay out what they see as worker-centric policies in the context of, if not a formal trade agreement, at least an economic agreement that they are negotiating. So we can expect to see that their vision of what that will be as included in the proposals that we see forthcoming. And I think part of the reason why it's taking time is because they understand that this becomes the new template, at least for those issues that are included in the negotiation. What are the implications for TPP and RCEP and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement? Well, I think those negotiations are ongoing regardless of the framework that the United States is putting forward. The RCEP, as you all know, is done and entered into force for most of the countries. The CPTPP is in force with now 4 countries who have requested membership, and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, it's a digital agreement, not a full free trade agreement, is also in force with several countries looking to join. So the framework, the Indo-Pacific framework that the United States is pursuing, will cover a number of issues that are important to the countries that are parties to those agreements, and in some cases include issues that are in those agreements like digital trade, but it will not duplicate those. And on many of those issues, they're covering specific topics that are not part of any of these trade agreements. So on the positive side, they're making progress and developing proposals in areas that are important to all of the countries that'll be participating. But on the downside, this initiative really won't do anything to level the playing field for US companies that are operating out of the US or operating out of a country that's not party to one of those trade agreements, because it doesn't include any market access or anything that would require congressional ratification. So these agreements will go on, and in parallel will be a framework. In terms of risks and opportunities for US-Korea cooperation going forward, I think there has been a lot of bilateral engagement over the past year. And that engagement is on a range of issues, positive and negative. And the countries have many opportunities to meet as they implement the bilateral free trade agreement. There are many bilateral initiatives that have gotten underway with state and commerce and others to talk about technology and innovation and supply chains and clean energy. Again, the similar topics are that will be covered in the framework, but bilaterally, so that the countries can begin to develop ideas of how they want to think through those issues and which elements are most important. Obviously, on supply chains, there are specific areas of the supply chain issue that are most pertinent to the US and Korea and their bilateral discussions that may be less relevant to some other countries. Similarly, on technology and innovation, just generally that areas of overlap and interest that are important to them and less so to other countries. The US has often talked about support for the new southbound policy and work that they want to do there. I think you'll see echoes of that in the infrastructure element of the Indo-Pacific framework. In terms of cooperation and risks, you all are very close to this and closer than I am, but I think there are always bilateral irritants in the relationship. The one that emerged over the last few months was the resolution of the 232. Korea reached an agreement with the United States during the Trump administration, and now that there have been negotiations between the EU and the US that resulted in better outcomes for the EU, I think Korea would like to see that renegotiate the 232 outcome renegotiated, but they're basically at the end of the line now, because other countries that do not have agreements are taking up the airtime, and there is not at the moment bandwidth to begin negotiations with Korea. Obviously, the elections may have some impact on bilateral relationships, bilateral economic engagement over the coming months, and how the countries want to work together. We're all watching North Korea. They seem frustrated that Russia's getting so much attention after they were frustrated that China was getting so much attention. So they're always a wild card in there. And then there's US-China. I think that the United States has tried to make clear that they're not trying to get countries to choose between the US and China, and they're not trying to decouple. But I think Korea has to navigate those tensions and the reality of decoupling in some sectors very, very carefully, as there's, an increasingly separate technology ecosystem in some areas, and they are tied to both. So that is a very complicated issue for them as they cooperate, and even as they look to work with the United States on the Indo-Pacific framework. On an outlook for a digital trade agreement, there was a lot of discussion, and there still is actually quite a bit of discussion about the US pursuing a digital trade agreement bilaterally, and whether that makes sense. And the reason people were talking about that is because, as I said at the beginning, there's a lot of frustration that there was no affirmative economic strategy, a recognition that it was going to be difficult to negotiate a trade agreement that would require congressional approval. Therefore, the most logical agreement that people thought that the United States could turn to was a digital trade agreement, because it wouldn't necessarily require congressional approval, even if it required congressional consultation. But now I think that since the United States has decided to work on digital trade issues in other fora, bilateral cooperative fora, and in this Indo-Pacific partnership, it may be that they want to either allow that work to go on simultaneously, or just fold in the work that they're doing bilaterally into the Indo-Pacific partnership. Here too, the complication and why I have that slow sign is because you would think, and when these proposals were first emerging about a digital trade agreement being a good option for the United States to pursue, you would think that this would have been just a very easy thing for the United States. There was a high standard agreement negotiated between the US and Japan bilaterally. There were a very high standard chapter on digital trade in the USMCA. But now that this administration has decided it wants to have a worker-focused approach to everything, they're rethinking what are the elements that should be in a digital trade agreement. And do they want to, as an administration, be strengthening the tech companies that many in the United States and in Congress are looking to discipline? So perhaps a difficult time to be looking at a digital trade agreement while there's so much domestic debate about regulation of the tech industry and an interest in trying to discipline them. What are the implications for US companies in Korea? Looking at the regional agreements, Korea stood back at the time that we began negotiating TPP, much to my personal chagrin. And I think I understood it at the time, having just concluded the bilateral FTA with the United States, and looking at trying to negotiate again with the United States, and also with Japan at the table, decided to take a pass. But I think now is trying to get in after the fact, knocking on the door to get into TPP. And that's something that I think, is really important for for Korea and US companies operating in Korea. They already have the benefits of RCEP, and those are immediate opportunities that they can take advantage of, and supply chains and value chains that they can become part of. But I think in terms of the regional agreements, and for companies operating in Korea, you have every interest in making sure that that negotiation and their entry into CPTPP moves as quickly as possible. So far, the CPTPP countries have been spending time with the UK, and they started out with the UK and are moving that part of the negotiation forward. And then you have China and Taiwan and Ecuador, for that matter, who have also sought to join the agreement. So where Korea falls on the list and how quickly that negotiation can move, I think is open to question. But there is obviously an interest in seeing that move as quickly as possible. On the Indo-Pacific framework, similarly, I think that AMCHAM companies have a real interest in making sure that Korea is part of this initiative and is actively involved in all of the modules in the negotiation. There is also a real interest in making sure that the outcomes are robust and that they're rapid. So as I said before, it's not really clear exactly what kinds of commitments the administration is looking to include, but for companies looking to see something meaningful come out of this, I think it's important that there are binding rules or standards and not just principles or pledges to cooperate, that there's really something meaningful that comes out of here. And that the countries that agree to negotiate are negotiating, and Korea negotiates in all of these modules, so that you have the ability for there to be coherence across this initiative. And obviously, I think it's important that this initiative moves quickly. It's taken a long time to get this started. It's a year into the administration. We're in an election year, and then we're past the midterms, and the time goes by very, very quickly. So it's important that if this is going to move, that there's pressure on the administration to move it as quickly as possible, if there's going to be benefits that are meaningful. On the bilateral work, I think, that will go on. And it's, as I said, I think really important to building trust and developing proposals that feed into other initiatives or address bilateral irritants. And that work should continue. Some of it will be very specific to concerns that particular companies have that doesn't feed into broader initiatives. So it's the only place to do it. But in other cases, it can feed into broader initiatives that can be meaningful for companies, beyond just Korea. And then I think the last question is, a return to TPP or CPTPP for the United States and what that would mean for Korea. One of the questions that comes up in discussion of this Indo-Pacific framework is this a Trojan horse for the administration to get back into CPTPP, which many stakeholders that are in the base of the Democratic Party are strongly opposed to. And what I would say to that is that there is a recognition within the administration on the Hill, and I think very broadly shared in the business community, that the fastest way to benefit US companies operating in Asia would be to just go back to TPP. Maybe it would need to be renegotiated in some ways. It is 6 or 7 years since the last commitments in that agreement were negotiated. So there's definitely updates that would be needed. But getting back into that agreement, regardless of what changes are needed, would need to be negotiated, is the fastest and most efficient way to improve the competitiveness of US companies operating in Asia. Whether or not the administration decides to do that, I think is very open to question. At this point, they're focused on the Indo-Pacific framework and trying to get results from that. But my own view is that were the administration to get back into TPP, the issues that they're negotiating in the Indo-Pacific framework would have to be elements of a new agreement. So the work they're doing there is valuable, whether it ends up standing alone or whether it feeds into a renegotiation of a broader trade agreement. So let me stop there, and I look forward to our discussion and your questions.
Barbara, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I think we all have learned a lot so far. And thanks for kicking things off for us in this first webinar of 2022 for the Trade and Customs Committee. Let's get started with some questions on US trade policy toward Asia and beyond. And you've already covered a lot of these things, but as you answer these questions, we'd appreciate any personal anecdotes you might want to share from your deep experience as Assistant USTR. And you know, any kind of personal insights you've gained from your experience would be really appreciated. First of all, last week, Korean Trade Minister Yo Han-koo, in his meeting with USTR Catherine Tai, mentioned that South Korea will participate in the US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And Tai also said earlier this month that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework will be similar in scope to the US-European Union Trade and Technology Council. What are the distinctive features of this US-EU TTC that might become part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? And you've talked a lot about modules. What opportunities do you expect there will be for US companies to participate within the individual modules? And how can they make their voice heard on the key issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that there have been a lot of statements both Ambassador Tai and Secretary Raimondo have made comparing this framework to other things. Raimondo has said it's stronger than CPTPP or TPP, and Tai has said it's like the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council that the US-EU formed. I guess my own view is it's kind of not like either. The Trade and Technology Council is a cooperative forum where the US and the EU are seeking to develop common approaches to international issues. So for instance, today I attended a TTC seminar on small businesses and cybersecurity, where they did a presentation for small businesses about how to strengthen their cybersecurity. There is work going on cooperation on developing standards in international fora. And since our standards bodies are private sector led and that many of theirs are private sector led, it's bringing together the private sectors and the governments and trying to have early warning on what can be done to make sure that as there's emerging technologies, companies and countries can cooperate to set standards that advance the interests of like-minded countries. I think here, you know, and they have also, you know, there are 10 groups under the TTC, and they're covering a lot of the similar sets of issues. But I think that the question here is this going to be a similar cooperative forum, or is this going to be a set of initiatives that includes modules that are negotiating real commitments among the parties? And, you know, I think that there's value in some of the cooperation that the US and the EU are doing. It's slow and gradual, and there's value in it. But I think given the architectures that are in the Asia Pacific right now and where the US sits, which is outside of both of those, it's really important that through an initiative like this, that they begin to negotiate real commitments on real issues that matter to our companies operating in the region. How you can get involved, I mean, the administration will be seeking input, and if they haven't directly asked for input, I think there's no reason why you shouldn't be offering your ideas of ways that they should be formulating the proposals for this initiative and what should be included, and that it should be real hard commitments and not mush. And that's something that they'll be developing as they start talking to these countries. But the earlier that everybody gets in with specific ideas, I think the better.
Thank you for that. Let's go talk about FTAs for a minute. U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been urging the U.S. government to adopt a more cohesive strategy for confronting China. And part of that is more FTAs possibly. Curious, negotiations for potential free trade agreements with trading partners are on hold right now. For example, with China, there's been in the past some discussions started for the phase 1 agreement with China, and there's also a first stage deal with Japan. I was wondering, do you think that these will be used as kind of a base for any further trade deals with these two countries, and what kind of impact that would have?
The U.S. Is talking to China now about the phase 1 deal, but to the best of my knowledge, there are no discussions of anything that would be called phase 2 at this point. There are discussions going on with third countries about issues of concern related to Chinese practices, but I don't think there are discussions that are going on directly, nor do I anticipate those in the foreseeable future. You know, regarding FTAs generally, I think there has been an arc and evolution of trade policy over the last 40 years of the way that the U.S. thinks about its approach to trade agreements. You know, so it was for a long time, we should negotiate multilateral trade agreements in the WTO because those bring the most benefits to the most countries. Then there was a movement toward bilateral trade agreements because the WTO was moving too slowly and the United States wanted to enhance the market access that it could negotiate bilaterally. And then we moved to TPP because we said, well, all these bilateral agreements, the multilateral was too slow and painstaking. The bilateral is similarly slow because you're negotiating one country at a time. And the result is slightly different trade agreements that create inconsistent rules across the region. That's not a good approach. We should negotiate regionally. That helps us straddle the difficulty of doing multilateral with, you know, the lack of coherence that you get when you negotiate bilaterally. The Trump administration said, no, we don't agree with that because we think you have more leverage when you negotiate bilaterally, but then they didn't really negotiate very much. They did the Japan deal and they did the renegotiation of USMCA to look a lot like TPP. And then this administration hasn't really said very much about its interest in negotiating bilaterally. I mean, it is possible that they will decide to pick up, for instance, the UK negotiation on the theory that they can develop a template with a like-minded country and then carry that forward. But I don't think that at this point, there's a lot of pressure on the administration to begin negotiations bilaterally, and that this Indo-Pacific framework seems to be, at least at this point, the most ambitious negotiation that they're contemplating.
In terms of China, through the RCEP and through potentially CPTPP, China will be getting greater access to significant Asian economies such as Korea. In your view, what particular advantages will China be gaining that U.S. companies should be worried about?
Well, I mean, China now has access through RCEP to all of the Asia Pacific, and they had bilateral agreements before that with many of the countries in the region. I think the key benefit, in that they have gained through RCEP was the rules of origin, which are very liberal and encourage the development of supply chains. And once those supply chains are established, I think it becomes much more complicated for another country that was not party to that agreement to break in. And that's wherein the issue of urgency comes for the United States. The US often, has been at the forefront of negotiating trade liberalization since the 1940s, and now has stepped back as though the rest of the world is going to wait until the United States decides to go forward and gives it instructions gives the rest of the world its view of how things are going to go forward, and until then they should wait. But that's not actually what's happening. The rest of the world is moving forward, and they're building these supply chains, which I think become, much more difficult for the US to deal with after the fact.
As you said, America is being left on the sidelines for now, at least. Let's move on to the issues of digital trade and supply chain resiliency, which might be of keen interest to some of our member companies. The Biden administration officials have said that the digital economy will be a pillar of a new Indo-Pacific economic framework to be led by the Commerce Department. Lawmakers and analysts are urging the Biden administration to use the Indo-Pacific economic framework to take swift action through a digital economy initiative. There have even been congressional hearings recently on the strategic importance of a digital trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific. In what specific ways do you think this initiative will work to the benefit of US businesses in Korea? And in this digital trade area in particular, where you mentioned that there's a lot of political pressure to kind of not necessarily help tech companies, what can stakeholders working in US businesses in Korea do to get their issues on the agenda and push it in the way that they want?
Yeah, all good questions. I think in terms of digital trade and pushing for a strong outcomes on digital trade, you're absolutely right that there have been several hearings and all kinds of statements from members of Congress in support of strong digital trade rules that they think would benefit US industry broadly, not just the tech companies. And I think several of the things that companies need to do is to remind the administration of a couple things. One is that when they think about a digital trade agreement, there's often, this reflexive, we don't want to help the tech companies. Setting that question aside, it's important to remember that every company is a digital company right now. Tech companies are one type of company that would benefit from a digital agreement, but every single company that's operating globally has an interest in strong digital trade provisions. And so when they think of wanting to help workers and help manufacturing in the United States, along with that comes, you need to have strong digital trade provisions and opportunities for companies to operate across markets and be able to transfer data and operate their AI the way they want to operate their AI, and everything else about the digital economy that is part of the way modern companies do business. The other thing is, there are a lot of elements that people are looking at as important to a digital trade agreement. Many of those were in USMCA or the US-Japan agreement. As I said, some additional elements were included in the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that the Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile negotiated. And that was, cooperating on things like fintech, electronic payment services, blockchain, quantum, AI, and things that have not been in previous trade agreements that is worth, that the US has a real interest in negotiating in order to stay in the forefront of emerging technologies. And the best way to do that is to be with, to be leading a group of countries that are setting the rules on those issues, or at least beginning to think through what those rules ought to look like so that they have a common approach. The other point that I think a lot of people when they're talking about digital trade to the administration talk about, well, small businesses are really dependent on digital trade, and so this would help them, and they focus their arguments on small business, and that's all true, and I don't disagree with it. But I think it's also important for them to understand that companies that are supporting strong digital provisions are not thereby saying, we're doing this because we oppose whatever regulation you may be thinking about as it relates to the tech sector. The two can progress simultaneously in tandem. Whatever it is the US is doing on privacy or on antitrust or on cybersecurity or any of the issues that are under discussion, and where agencies or Congress are looking at either regulating or legislating, that will go forward. And that can be incorporated into a trade agreement. Nobody's arguing that this should be a means of either making policy. You're not trying to legislate through a trade agreement, nor are you saying there shouldn't be legislation. What we're saying is there needs to be strong digital trade rules so companies can operate with some certainty across markets. And I think those are the kinds of things that need to be said over and over and over again, as well as providing data about the importance of this kind of an agreement and digital trade to your companies, especially manufacturing.
Thanks for the comprehensive answer. Since we're limited on time, I'll just ask one last question and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. The Biden administration has called for a critical supply chain resiliency program. You've touched on this in your presentation. Can you explain how this type of program might affect US businesses in Korea and if there's any steps that should be taken to get ready?
This is an area where there's some balance between the interest in strengthening resilience domestically and working with partners. And that's where the bilateral discussions are really important, because they help think through what is it that the administration is trying to do, or what is it that other countries, for that matter, are trying to do to ensure that they have strengthened their resilience domestically and they have assured domestic supply of critical products and inputs, and that they're working together with partners and allies. And so I think the discussions, as I understand it so far, have focused on information sharing and mapping exercises, and then to determine, once they have all of that done, what they're going to do to ensure that kind of resilience. What part of that means, for instance, on semiconductors, that those semiconductors need to be produced in the United States, and what part of that means that we're relying on trusted relationships that may have certain specifications, certain agreements among the countries about how they're going to ensure that that supply is protected and available when needed. But I think in this case, I don't know that the administration yet has specific proposals for what it means when it made that announcement. It knows that it wants to build a resilient supply chain. It knows that semiconductors are going to be a key part of that. But as it pertains to the way that they're working with partners, I think that's something still under discussion.
Okay, we have one question from our audience so far. Do you see any implications on the elections this March and in June? Not sure exactly implications as to which topic, but this is someone would like some more input on what kind of impact the elections would have on US trade policy towards Korea, if you have any views on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it seems to me that if the two countries are working together under, for instance, the Indo-Pacific framework, but also bilaterally, it's hard for me to imagine the outcome of the election affecting that type of cooperation. I think, the outcome of the election certainly could affect Korea's view of the balance that it wants to strike between the US and China. And that may have some impact in the way that it sees certain issues. But I think for the approach that the US is taking on the Indo-Pacific partnership, it is specifically not to say this is not targeted at China. It is intended to strengthen the competitiveness of the countries that are part of this initiative, and also to strengthen their ability to respond to coercion from wherever that comes from. So I don't actually think it will have any impact on the economic part of the bilateral relationship, although it may have an impact on other aspects of the relationship.
Thank you for the answer. And since we're out of time now, I just want to say thank you. And I'm sure all of our guests are really appreciative of hearing your views on these issues. Very important times, lots to talk about. And thank you so much again for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara and Ari, for a very insightful discussion on the trade policy towards Asia Pacific. I personally learned a lot about the overall trade policy environment and its implication for Korea. So, and I hope many of you have found the session as helpful as I did. If you have any further questions on the topic, please feel free to reach out to Barbara. And we'll have a recording of today's webinar available through our YouTube channel. So please feel free to check it out when it's available. Our Trade and Customs Committee will be offering quarterly seminars throughout the year. Our next webinar taking place in April with Korea Customs Service. So I would encourage many of you to join us next time. If you have any questions regarding the committee, please feel free to reach out to Ari as well. So with that, I'd like to thank again our speakers, Barbara and Ari, and thank you all for joining us today and wish you all a happy Lunar New Year. Thank you.
Thanks, Una. Thank you.